just you can call me Daddy. And if you want to follow me on Facebook, you can find me at james.desborough, Postmortem Studios, all one word, JD Writer and JGD Games. Representation has been very much on my mind recently. I thought that my opinion might have changed, even just from last week to this week, but ultimately it really hasn't. I had several arguments on the tail end of last week about reasonable versus unreasonable accommodation of quirks and peculiarities. Jordan Peterson's Addiction brought up C16 and the trans issue again, and the compelled speech versus politeness and all the rest. I was also being attacked for objecting to diversity representation that I often find to be patronising and tokenistic. Not all of it, just most. And people assume that because I'm a cisgender white male that I don't have any things that require representation and so on. This just speaks to other people's bias and issues. But then various things have conspired to keep the idea of representation and tokenism and being patronised in my mind. And some of this was quite challenging, but in the end it ultimately reconfirmed my opinion. So don't expect any sort of sea change in this video, but follow me through the process. I've been playing Pokemon Sword on the Switch. I know, kids game, blah 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 blah, yeah. Sometimes you just want something fun that's not particularly mentally taxing or too demanding of your attention or intelligence. Now it's set in this, I think it's called the Galar region, which shows just exactly how much attention I've actually been paying to the game, which is kind of an analogue for the United Kingdom. And a lot of people assume that because I'm white, because I'm male, because I'm cisgender, that all entertainment made everywhere for everyone is necessarily directly tailored towards me. What I think they miss out there is that there are huge cultural differences, even between nations that are more racially homogenous and more predominantly white. The obsession with representation and race and so on is primarily an American issue and an American export. Suffice it to say that representing white male cisgender Americans doesn't necessarily do a great deal for white male cisgender Brits, or Brits as a whole altogether. American culture is significantly different to British culture. So going into this, I was kind of this is what really sort of began to challenge my opinion, I suppose. I was enjoying the fact that we actually had somewhere that was an analogue for Britain to begin with. You know, that was nice, that was different. I wish GTA would do another London, for example. But the more I played it, the less this became an interesting factor. And actually, the more aggravating it became. Because it's very surface level, on the one hand, almost patronising, stereotypical, and also the things that don't fit become immensely jarring, or the things that are slightly misunderstood or misapplied become jarring, to the point where I actually think I would enjoy the game more if it was set in an entirely made up place, or retained the trappings of Japanese culture more, with some of that still there, obviously. Things like the trains, the policemen and so on, those are all interesting, though it does beg the question how police use Pokemon in that world, and whether they count as weapons or not. So there's little visual details, there's cues, there's audio cues in the music and so on. It's all well and good. The cuisine, you make curries. Now the British obsession with curry is well known, and I would rather they went with that than, say, how bland British food is supposed to be, mythologically speaking. But that started to grate and aggravate when it was the only kind of thing you could do. And hearing Scottish music playing when you're in an area that looks like Mexico is extremely jarring. And why is there a desert in the middle of Britain? I mean, the Midlands and the North, they're cultural and economic deserts, but not literal deserts. So gradually, as the game has worn on, as things have gone on, it has become a source of irritation and annoyance rather than a feeling of acceptance and representation. So at the start I found that quite challenging because I was actually enjoying being represented for once. But as the game wore on, it became more and more apparent that this was very surface level, and this was tokenistic and even patronising. So the enjoyment that I got from that faded pretty rapidly, and it showed its hand.
There are no bogeymen.
That's not true.
I don't much care for this current season of Doctor Who, and I've been semi-hesitant upon saying so because I wanted to give it a chance. Some previous Doctors I haven't liked the cut of their jib until they settled into the part, but no, I definitely don't like this season. And it's not Jodie Whittaker necessarily, it's not the fact that the Doctor has tits necessarily, though the total disrespect for canon that is going on in the series is irritating. It's the patronising tone, it's the tokenism. Now, up until now, I haven't been one of the tokens being patronised. So, because any criticism is met with shrieks of misogyny or racism or whatever else, I haven't felt able to necessarily speak up. But this time they did touch on one of the protected characteristics into which I fall, the woke categories into which I fall. And it was extremely surface level, thoroughly patronising, and left me quite sort of angry at the show and at the television. This time they kind of obliquely touched on depression. Now, one of the companions has dyspraxia, though that hasn't seemed to have come up very much, if at all, since the first couple of episodes. But at least that character has some sort of arc. There's more of an exploration of them as a person, them as a character. The background character who suffered from depression in this was essentially an entirely blank slate. Some of this is the fault of the fact that the series are so short, the episodes are so short, you don't have time to breathe in Doctor Who, and you haven't since New Who launched, really. That's a shame. But it was just so surface level, so undeveloped. It didn't offer any insight or meaning, and it was just, at the end of the show it was, if you've been affected by any of the issues in this episode, call this number. It was just singularly unhelpful. And we didn't even really know, unless you picked up on the cues, that this character was depressed until the end, when they went into this kind of group meeting, which in my experience aren't terribly helpful. Self-help isn't necessarily terribly helpful. You should go to a professional. So I felt that was a little bit unhelpful too. Should be encouraging people to get diagnoses and to see professionals, and then it's very much a secondary thing to have self-help and group help and community help and all the rest of it. But I was left aggravated and annoyed by the way that my illness had been tokenized in the episode. And when you look at some of the other aspects of the episode, you can see the same thing going on. Why Aleppo? Why Syria? Did we go into any real detail about that? About the time? About the setting? About why? As they had to somehow crowbar into the episode. Ancient Islam was more accepting of mental health issues and more enlightened in its treatment. I think, if we're honest, we know that it was only put in Syria, only put in Aleppo because Syria is in the news, because the civil war is in the news, and as an excuse to put in that line about ancient Islam. Today's Islam, not so much. So I found all these things annoying, but now that they've done that same patronising, tokenistic approach to me, I feel able to speak up about it now.
Your goal is to kill yourself, and my job is to keep you alive.
In the UK, more and more of us are asking for help.
I finally got around to starting to watch Losing It, which is a series about mental health in the UK, particularly child and adolescent mental health services, about which there was a huge blow-up about generally how useless they are on Twitter some time ago. So I finally got around to starting to watch some of it. I'm afraid to say that as someone with pretty goddamn severe mental health issues who has self-harmed in the past, I'm pretty sure that some of these kids are faking it. Faking it for attention, faking it to feel special and important. I mean, you can argue that if you're going to the extent of cutting yourself, however shallowly, in order to get attention, then you probably are mentally ill, but still. The ones who genuinely are ill, when you look at them, you can tell they're either agitated and extroverted, or they're very introverted and quiet, and the show's segments about them is largely shot around them and focusing on the parents and the siblings and the support workers rather than the kid themselves. The ones who I think are faking it are extremely effusive, vocal, and spouting a huge amount of what can only really be called Tumblr jargon, and it's a shame, and it puts me in two minds as to whether this is a useful show or not, because I'm sure a lot of people who watch this will look at this and say, well, there's nothing wrong with this kid. That's concerning, but this was still a better approach, and when you contrast that with the way in which people with mental health issues are addressed in other shows, or the tokenistic way in which anyone who's a member of any sort of minority is approached in shows, it makes a useful stark contrast. Now, I'm not saying that you have the time necessarily in a Doctor Who episode to do it full justice and talk about it and around it in a way that is properly fulfilling, but grounding it in the real and centering it in the stories would perhaps be more useful. And this is where I would contrast things in fiction as well. When you tokenistically put in a character of a racial minority, or with mental health issues, or with a sexual minority, or gender minority, or whatever else it might be, it falls flat. And when you're doing it just because it falls flat, whereas in, say, something like Black Panther, which isn't as good as people like to say, but it was still a better approach to it. It centers the African character, the African nation, the different approaches of blackness, the Malcolm X versus MLK, almost even, that duality. There's some depth to it, at least, just a bit. The last thing that's sort of brought all this together in a neat little package is yet another Twitter fuss, this time over Scott Malthouse's Romance of the Perilous Land RPG. Now, it's supposed to be a game of sort of Arthurian legend and British folklore, but if you take a close look at that cover there, the woman looks fairly East Asian. The probably a magician at the back would appear to be black, and if we're talking about medieval Britain or a medieval Britain analogue, that doesn't necessarily make a great deal of sense. Now, there are legitimate criticisms to be made, legitimate critiques to be made when a game or a film or a story rides roughshod over history and over foundational cultural myths of various nations, just as it would be if you rewrote Anansi as a white man. These aren't the be-all and end-all. And of course people will say, you know, there's dragons and magic, why shouldn't there be people of different races? I've gone on at length previously about this weird paradox, that the more fantastical elements you introduce, the more the rest has to make sense in order to have people continue to suspend their disbelief. But it's not that important either way. Representation doesn't really matter that much at the end of the day, at least according to the research. What it does produce is niggles, which do throw people out of their suspension of disbelief. That said, Varg Vikernes, who has his own sort of knockoff D&D with rather racist undertones and even overtones, has set his sights on this game and decided to slam it. So what you now have is two sets of people, one lot of whom will go and buy My Farog to support Varg Vikernes, another lot of people that will go to buy Romance of the Perilous Land to stick two fingers up to Varg Vikernes, and neither party will be buying Game A or Game B because it's any good, or because it treats the source material with respect, or any of these other reasons. And also, anyone who makes any of those kind of legitimate criticisms is going to be lumped in with the Nazis. And anyone who makes any kind of excuses or apologia or says anything good about the game is going to end up lumped in the camp with the wokies. So let me just say, fuck Varg Vikernes, check out the game, and if it's any good, buy it and play it. My preference would probably be for something like Dragon Warriors or Pendragon or The Witcher RPG, if you want the same sort of thing without all the swirling politics around it. But you know, check it out, because fuck Varg. I know some of you play My Farog and you're not racist, horrible shitheads, but Varg is. If you're enjoying the game and you're making good use of it, fine and dandy. See, the British mythology is kind of my bag. Pre-Christian British mythology is something that's had a lifelong interest for me, and was my area of study in particular when I was studying these things. And it is annoying to see other races just kind of crammed in a tokenistic way. I mean, look, they've got the black guy right at the back on the cover, for example. And to present this as some kind of meaningful, wonderful thing, when it's just not historically accurate at all. And it does throw you out of your suspension of disbelief. It does aggravate and jar when something like that happens. And unfortunately, there's just going to be no route to make those kind of valid criticisms because of people like Varg being dicks. So what can you do? So at the end of all this, what have we learned? Representation doesn't really matter. If you're represented, but poorly, in a tokenistic and patronising way, it's even more aggravating than if you weren't represented at all. That there is no winning these arguments, that people will just divide into camps. You know, it'll sell having some controversy, and other people can latch onto it and make money from controversy, but it doesn't actually serve any of the purposes that we're looking for, that we're after. Good games, good stories, the ability to suspend disbelief and to immerse oneself in a setting without encountering jarring elements, all of these kind of things. So if you're gonna include people, do it properly. I don't say that you should have sensitivity readers or whatever, just consider it properly. Just throwing down a couple of little passages or a disclaimer, the author of this work is terribly racist, but we've made the game anyway. This sort of thing is meaningless. It's meaningless frippery. It's pandering to one side and it's deliberately tweaking the nipples of the other, and none of it is any good or any use to anybody. It's all meaningless, surface level nonsense. And so at the end of the day, I come back to the conclusion that I think it's just patronising and insulting. And that's it. Zang.
The Atomic Age, with its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent. Agent of Swing.